Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. We know there's a lot of things going on right now, and we truly appreciate you taking the time to spend this time with us. It is indeed my pleasure to share with you today the COSI superstar, Nicole Alford. Thank you. Thanks for joining
Awesome.
us.
Thank you, Dr. Summers, for that amazing introduction. And there is, before I get started, I do also want to recognize Michelle Shaw. I saw her come in. She's the Director of Student Accessibility Services at FAU. So feel free to, I'm happy to have you join us today as we talk about universal design. And so please feel free if you'd like to chime in at any time. As I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about universal design, online courses for all students. So I wanted to start off with a Slido poll. And so I'm going to escape out of my presentation for a minute, just so I can go in here and kind of see where everyone is at with their knowledge. Okay, so excellent. So the majority of us, or almost the majority, I should say, are familiar with the concept and use it in their course, which is amazing. A couple of us are familiar but haven't implemented it. Some are new, and we have a couple others. So, oh, perfect. Excellent. Familiar. Okay, excellent. So what I'll do is I'm going to adjust my presentation just slightly today because I do go over some of the main UDL guidelines in the first part of the presentation. So I'm going to go a little bit faster through those, but I will make sure to pause and ask for any questions as I go through them. So I'm going to hop back into my presentation so that we can get started. So today we're going to be covering UDL guidelines, that's Universal Design for Learning guidelines. We're going to try to actively reframe objectives to make sure that they're inclusive, including these UDL guidelines. We're going to briefly touch on emotion and learning. And then we're going to go into the synchronous and asynchronous components and web conferencing for UDL. So that's probably going to be the main focus of today's session, given that we are in this high flex online face-to-face virtual modality. That's probably the most interest right now. So hopefully by the end of the session, you should be able to define universal design for learning, which we're about to get into that definition. Describe the different UDL guidelines and identify why universal design for learning is beneficial for all students. And then explore techniques to implement universal design for learning. So throughout this session, there will be activities using Padlet that we will interact with today. So keep those phones or links ready because we will have that interactive component. And I do want to start off with the definition from CAST. CAST is the Center for Applied Special Technology. And that's where the majority of these resources came from today. CAST and the UDL on campus resources. So they have incredible, detailed, specific resources out there, and I will be providing links to those in this presentation, along with the entire presentation to everyone who attended. So Universal Design for Learning is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. So this really is for all subjects, all classes, and all students, which is why we named the title of this presentation for all students. Because really it doesn't matter where or how whatever you learn best, all of these principles today will enhance that experience. So the three UDL guidelines that we will cover, again, since we're all somewhat familiar with this principle, I'm going to go a little bit faster through these than I typically would. But the first is engagement, which is the why, the representation, the what, and the action and expression, the how. So where I got these from, I'm actually going to escape my presentation for a moment, and I'm going to go to the CAST website. So this is the CAST's website for UDL guidelines, which is where I got a lot of the resources that you will see today. The website is udlguidelines.cast.org, and you'll see these are the main topics that we'll be covering today, and we'll go through each of these and offer some examples and tips of each one as to how you can apply it in your course. I'm going to head back over into the presentation now and go back to that slide and get into these guidelines. So for engagement, the first guideline that we'll talk about, we want to recruit that interest. And I know sometimes I hear a lot of, my students, they're there, maybe their cameras are off, I can't see them, I don't know if they're engaged. And so some of these tips can kind of help with that in terms of recruiting their interest. So ask learners, how can they help and create the activities for the class? So if there's an objective or some sort of overarching goal you want students to complete in a course, see what things that they would come up with in terms of how they would demonstrate it. Ask learners to set their own behavioral goals and personal academic goals. Use activities that involve imagination to solve novel and relevant problems. So a lot of times, if you have a real world scenario, we're going to use a couple scenarios today. It kind of gets them thinking of, okay, this is actually something that I can apply. This is something that is relevant to my life. And that's what we'll kind of go over today as well. Make sense of complex ideas in creative ways. Now, this could be challenging for sure, trying to make maybe a complex calculus or maybe a complex accounting or nursing or really any subject that has some sort of complex component to it, making creative ways. Again, I would go back to that first bullet and say, how would the students do it? What are some ideas they have and kind of pull them? Design authentic, real-world, and reflective activities that communicate the purpose. So a lot of the time students may say, oh, I just submitted that, or oh, why am I doing that? And one of the ways that you can engage and recruit that interest to motivate your students is to get them involved in these real-world examples. Think of ways that they can apply this to a scenario, maybe in a small group, or maybe just individually in a discussion of how they would solve the problem using a concept. And I think you'll notice throughout the presentation today, the focus on reflective activities for students. A lot of the times we ask students to do a lot of things because we have these goals and objectives that they need to meet for this course. But a lot of the time, having the students reflect on their own personal experience as to why they're learning this, how is it going to benefit them in the future, or kind of what their takeaways were from the concept can help facilitate that. Using charts and calendars, giving them that reminder. I'm going to go into sustaining that effort and persistence. You'll notice throughout the presentation there are these gray bars with some bolded tips, and these are the ones that kind of stood out to me the most. There are many more on CAST's website, but again, I'm just kind of going through a little bit quicker than I usually would. So to sustain that effort, we want to prompt learners to kind of restate what's going to happen in the course or in the assignment, have maybe them explain it to a partner and kind of see where that maybe communication gaps are, things like that, using scaffolded learning, which is really, really helpful. So talking about the assessments are so important. A lot of the times, maybe we've done the same assessment, same quiz, same project in multiple sections, multiple years, but the students, it's brand new for them each term. And so you'll see as I continue that, having them in the discussion of the assessment, maybe setting aside 5-10 minutes of a synchronous class time, or maybe a short 5-minute video explaining the assignment, maybe providing an example and how it's applied, could help them in sustaining that persistence in completing the activities. So gathering those relevant examples and connecting it to their cultural backgrounds and interests, that's super important. We'll talk a little bit about how to gauge those backgrounds and interests. Differentiate the degree of difficulty. You don't want everything to be super difficult. You kind of want to give them maybe some self-checks, give them an opportunity to practice and then implement the solution. Learning groups are also good. When using learning groups, I think this is often overlooked, is creating those expectations and norms for a group. In our online courses, when we have group discussions, we have something called a team charter or a learner charter. And it kind of outlines, okay, what are my skills? What are your skills? When's a good time for you to meet? How can we best collaborate? So having those types of rubrics and norms can help that the student persists if they understand and they feel like they're being heard in their student group as well as to their faculty. And then this is probably my favorite point of this slide, is providing that feedback that emphasizes the effort and improvement in achieving the objectives. Because a lot of the times they'll just get a grade, or they may get, this is wrong, here's how to do it. But if they show some sort of effort, some sort of attempt or practice, highlighting that attempt and saying, this was really good. Here's what you understood. Here's where the improvement is. And here's where it's going to get you. Having that formula can help with that feedback. Okay, this is going to be the last slide of engagement. So I'll go through it a little bit quickly. Self-regulation. So this is, again, how can you, instead of having those constant reminders, which are very important, and I'll talk about those in a minute, giving them prompts, giving them guides, rubrics, checklists. We have a to-do list in our module content page template. Gives them the freedom and that self-regulatory behaviors to be able to do things at their own pace, understand kind of what is expected of them, and then what they need to do. You'll see, again, there are themes throughout these tips, and I will summarize them when we get to the end as well. But using those real-life simulations, the timely feedback, the scaffolding is all really important. Okay, so now we're going to get into the action part. I know I went through that kind of fast, so if I need to go back to any of the slides, please let me know. But I would like you to go to this Padlet. I don't know if we can put that Padlet link in the chat. Oh, and I do see a comment from Michelle Shaw. Thank you so much, University of Washington Do It program for universal design. Excellent.
And Nicole, she also has recommended another book, which I think that we'll include when we send the information out.
Incredible. Thank you so much for that. Okay, yes, if we want to go to that Padlet, I'm going to hop in there with you guys. So it's this first thing here. So as you guys comment in this Padlet, I think we just put that link in the chat. We're going to be using this Padlet throughout the session today to kind of really get those actions and seeing what we can do. So based on some of the scaffolding, maybe some of the feedback techniques, what's something in your course that you think you can take away from that engagement piece? And as you enter those, they'll appear on the screen. So we'll just take a couple minutes. I can go back to the presentation. Think about some of those self-regulatory behaviors with the checklists. Go back. Sustaining that effort, giving them a voice in the assessments, providing them with the feedback that they need, connecting it to their backgrounds and interests. Let me go back one more time. And then recruiting that interest, right? So getting them involved, thinking of those creative ways of getting them there. So I'm going to X and out of that and go back to the Padlet. Open-ended prompts. Yes, that is a great technique to getting that engagement. Thank you. It kind of gives them that freedom as well to kind of think, get that critical thinking component that kind of has that gear moving. Yes, asking them to participate in those goals. Exactly. So sometimes we have goals we want for the students, but the students may also have goals, like why they're taking this course or what interests them about that. Depending on what level you're at, if you're in a general education course or maybe a more advanced, maybe master level course, those can also all kind of tie into it. Having some control over which assignments they choose. Yeah, and that can be a bit tricky with alignment, but there's always a way. And we'll talk about how we get around that with inclusive objectives, which you can kind of see here as we get to scenario one. We're going to talk about how we can maintain alignment through Quality Matters Standards, which is a nationally recognized organization for quality online courses, and have those inclusive objectives to allow for the flexibility in assessments. Reflection papers. I don't know, I didn't do a poll on this, but I wonder how many of us actually ask students to reflect on the assignments that they submit, why they're submitting them, how it impacts them. Because I think if we can have that, it kind of gives them that, okay, well, this is why I'm doing it. It helps me kind of figure that out. Detailed constructive feedback. I know feedback takes a long time, especially for those high enrollment courses. So there's some definitely techniques to kind of go around that and still provide that rich feedback through rubrics, or if you have like templated feedback that you give a lot of the time, there's ways to still give that rich constructive feedback, even in a large class, but I understand that it is time consuming. Excellent. So I'm actually going to hop back into our presentation here. And so you guys are right on target with some of my summary items. So I'm going to go right into representation. So representation is about perceptions, language, symbols, and comprehension. So we're going to go over those sections today. So displaying information in flexible formats, understanding the size of text and image and graphs, tables, and other visual content in your presentations. Having that contrast, I know there is an excellent color contrast checker. The name of it has escaped me, but you can basically put in any color contrasts to this website, and it kind of provides an output of if it has enough contrast. Also, now Word and Microsoft products also will tell you if you have enough color contrast. So that's really helpful. Understanding the speed and timing of animations. I have mine on click right now, but if I needed to slow down or speed up, I have the power to do that because it is on a click. The fonts, any visuals, making sure you have alt text or descriptions, having the speech to text or automated voice. I know if you are in a Zoom call and you save to the cloud, you could turn on transcripts. So anyone who needs a transcript, you can provide that for your online class. And then a lot of the times it's hard to read. I know I'm reading some of these to you and they're on the screen. And I'm trying to give you kind of multiple ways of understanding the information. So I'm reading some of them, I'm giving some explanations, but they're also on the screen. So that kind of gives, sometimes we say, oh, you can read that on the screen. And we have to keep in mind that sometimes having it read aloud or having a dialogue about that concept can definitely help all learners. Again, I'm going a little fast through this, but especially if you're in a language course or something like that, having different types of specific vocabulary or terms. Like I started this presentation talking about CAST. I provided what the acronym meant, and we went to the website that CAST has. So it's kind of setting that up and saying, here's where I'm getting this information, here's where it means, here's what it means, and providing that structure. I know Math ML, Dr. Perkins, one of our learning strategists, uses this for our e-texts. So that was a really good thing in here. And one thing that I really enjoyed about CAST recommendations for this is what we recommend sometimes, and if you take our Teaching Online Pedagogy and Practice course, you'll get an example of this. And also Michelle Bukansky-Brock also has a really great getting to know you survey. And you can ask them about their dominant languages of your students and say, what are you most comfortable in? And then kind of adjusting the materials and seeing how to best teach that student what the goals of the course are. So that might just be a fun way to kind of modify your content and engage your learners at the same time. So for comprehension, linking it to prior knowledge, kind of gauging where they are. So as you saw in this presentation, I gave a slide to kind of see where my audience is in their level of knowledge. And then I'm kind of adjusting my presentation to that. So I'm going a little bit faster than I would in these concepts, and then kind of building on that, hopefully today. Using analogies and metaphors, we have an instructional designer, Kathy, who is excellent at metaphors, and it makes everything kind of easier to understand when you have this relevant knowledge of this more common experience and you're connecting it to a concept. Giving explicit prompts for each step in a sequential process. What may be really common to save a file with a certain naming convention or use some sort of citation formatting that you're familiar with may not be so familiar for a student, so just giving them those explicit prompts. Again, we talked about scaffolding and organizers, and I thought to myself, I know we get a lot of emails. I know emails can be super time consuming, but if it's an important deadline and someone reminds me maybe 2 or 3 times, I'm more grateful that they reminded me than if I would have missed it. So I think it's okay to give those reminders, those announcements. Maybe it's an inbox in Canvas, maybe in a group, you have this a student reminder, a student lead in a group remind their team, things like that. So we're going to take another break and we're going to talk about representation. So in the representation that we discussed about today, it's that same Padlet link. So I think we can maybe put that in the chat so we can get back to that link. But if not, that's okay. It's that same link that we had before. And so I'm going to exit out of here. And again, the representation focuses on that perception, the language and symbols, and the comprehension. So we want to put them in this, if that's okay, in this summarizing action and expression. I'm going to go back to the slides one more time. Talking a little bit about how the information is displayed, having that alt text, if you can, descriptive text is even better, which is awesome. Having those auditory cues, embedding that vocabulary, maybe that prior knowledge or unfamiliar syntax, explaining acronyms, what they mean, how they get there, doing that getting to know you quiz for the dominant languages of students in your course, and then anchoring that instruction in prior knowledges and having those metaphors. So I'm going to escape back into the Padlet and see if we have any tips and techniques for that. Oh, I am so sorry. We are on representation. I have these in the wrong order. I apologize. I do love these comments already on scenario 1. And so maybe we'll speed past action and expression, maybe in just about 5 minutes, so that we can get to that scenario and talk a little bit more about rewriting that objective. Exactly, captioning for videos. That's a huge component, having those captions. If you do have a student who's able to do kind of real-time captions as you're talking, that would be super awesome. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in action expression, where having multiple students take notes and sharing them to the Canvas course kind of does a lot of different things to get the students kind of involved in the learning. Going into that, getting that buy-in and interest. So I'm going to switch right back into the presentation here under action and expression. So we have some physical action. So thinking about what software you're selecting and figuring out if it is keyboard accessible. So sometimes we have this really cool tool and making it accessible. Maybe you have to reach out to the company to see if they have an accessible version or something like that. It's always a good idea just so you have some sort of guidelines for all students, because sometimes it may just be helpful to have that alternative. Using social media and interactive tools, having them kind of storyboard or concept map. If you attended our session last week, Kent did a presentation on Miro. Excuse me, if you're interested in that. And then differentiating mentors, having kind of maybe student mentors kind of mentoring each other. If someone's doing really well and they want to help another student out in the class to kind of get to that higher level thinking, that's always a good idea, because I know it's time consuming. And then getting those novel concepts. Giving them the goals and objectives, keeping it consistent. So in our slides, we have a consistent framework. So we have the objectives, the introduction, the to-do, the assignments, and the reading. They're always in the same place, every module, and it kind of allows for that consistency, so they know what's going to come up and what they're expected. Again, having that self-monitoring and reflection components, identifying with the type of feedback they're seeking. So some students prefer maybe a video if they want a more personal, maybe they want to see your face and they want the audio type of feedback on their paper, or they prefer like track changes. They want to see the actual things that they can do in the spot on the paper where they can improve. So that's kind of can be part of getting to know you survey. I know, again, differentiating that feedback can be time consuming, but I think you're going to get a lot out of it, and so are the students. So I'm going to skip action and expression right now, but please feel free to go into the Padlet as I continue and add some of the strategies that you would use to kind of implement some of the things we talked about for action and expression. So these are my overarching takeaways that kind of I summarized all into one. Make it relevant, make it relatable, provide alternatives, provide options and choice, embed reminders throughout the course, explain the purpose of the assignment and the content that's being presented, give them outlines, checklists, examples, and detailed rubrics, put yourself in the learner's shoes, emphasize the process. not necessarily the product all the time, but make sure that you're having discussions about the process and what improvement looks like. Researching the software and program that you require students to use, allow student and instructor feedback throughout the course, so peer feedback and instructor feedback. Gathering student feedback about your teaching style from the students. How are you doing? What's going on? How can you improve? You'll see in the Padlet, there's even a space for you to put how this presentation can be improved. Because there's always something that we can improve on, and ask the students to reflect on their experience and assessments in the course. So now we're on to that objective example. So according to the UDL on campus, from a UDL perspective, goals and objectives should be attainable by different learners in different ways. Sometimes we link the goal to the achievement instead of maybe the goal of the process or what we actually want them to learn. So I'm going to escape here and we're going to go to that Padlet on the objective, because I think I saw some really awesome comments on this as well. Oh, perfect. We'll definitely get to the action and expression and the representation comments, but I want to focus on this scenario here. So here's the sample objective. Write a paragraph about how the circulatory system works. What can you think are the barriers of this goal? And how could you rewrite it to make it more broad? Think about what does this objective get at? What is the overarching goal the student is going to learn from this objective? I know it might not be in your domain, but overarching, what is this instructor trying to get out from the student? Do they really want them to know how to write a paragraph? Do they want them to know how the circulatory system works? So we have a couple comments here. Does not clearly specify how deep is the student to go into the circulatory system. That's important. It does not. Some students might do better drawing a concept map. Yes, exactly. So drawing a concept map would probably get the same outcome. The student would be able to demonstrate their ability to kind of show you that they understand the circulatory system. It may not be a paragraph, but they could probably maybe enhance their knowledge or their level of understanding through a concept map. Exactly. So that was a really, really great point, and I'm glad that that we hit on that, because I'm going to go back to the presentation. And this was a solution that UDL on campus provided. So writing a paragraph adds an additional task over the mastery of the concept, right? So it depends. If you're in a English class and writing the paragraph, which our next example is about an English class, but if you're in an English class and writing the paragraph is the goal, then that's a different story. But in this class, we were talking about the circulatory system. So describe a complete cycle. So it goes back to the other comment of how deep. So we want the complete cycle of the circulatory system. And it allows them to, as you mentioned, create a diagram, maybe write the steps out, label an image, maybe do a short video of them explaining it on themselves. Like, there's so many options here that students can demonstrate their level of understanding of a concept over than just one. So it becomes more of a learning goal than performance goal, and it kind of lets them choose how they want to do that. So thank you. So now we're going to go on to another example in terms of a learning objective. So I'm going to go back to the Padlet. I apologize. I think I just put the answer in there. But I'm sorry for moving things around. So in a college writing seminar class, there's a lot of different things, in a like a general writing class that a student needs to know. And a lot of times we say, okay, turn in your annotated bibliography, or write a thesis statement, or write your introduction paragraph. But a lot of the times kind of figuring out how do they know what to include in an introductory paragraph, or what is a thesis statement to them. Maybe in their K through 12 environment, they learned it a little bit differently than your expectations. And so the grading might be a little off. So what are some ways that students can demonstrate their knowledge of a thesis statement? How can you tell that they know what a thesis statement is? To kind of scaffold their learning. So this goes back to that scaffold learning component, where instead of just saying, hey, go write that thesis statement, we talk a little bit about what their understanding of a thesis statement is and how it can be applied. So if anyone has any ideas on maybe an activity a student could do to demonstrate their knowledge of what a thesis statement is. And then we'll go over some of the examples. Oh, yes, show 3 examples. Oh, and I love to ask a class to comment on, it's kind of like the 2 truths and a lie, maybe, where you have 2 good ones and a not so good one. And I think that that's an excellent component, and especially showing others, when we'll talk about how having 2 or 3 people take notes in a class and then sharing those notes with the class, and of course switching those students out each class, not only do they engage by they have to take the notes, but they also have that peer component. Their fellow students are going to see these thesis statements that they choose or the notes that they write. And so they kind of may put a little more effort into it because they know that they're going to be seen by others. But absolutely, I love that. I love that answer. That's great. And I'll leave that open for any more as we continue on here. But these are excellent, excellent comments so far. And thank you so much for participating in that. But exactly, they could, do a video, examples, write a narrative about their understanding of a thesis statement. So I'm going to briefly touch on emotion and learning. So I'm going to give an example of a science lab. So sometimes these science lab activities can pique their interest. They are really exciting. They get that arousal level up. It maintains their attention, depending on the activity. But it can also be anxiety producing and kind of maybe focused on too much of the wow factor instead of the actual components that are happening. And so there's a spectrum of kind of this learning and emotion graphic that I'm about to display. And so this kind of shows you kind of how their interaction with the assessments can be on a large spectrum depending on their emotions. And right now, students have a lot of emotions. There's so much going on in the world that considering the emotional needs of the student as you're developing your assessments, it's really important, I think, in this moment. And so kind of figuring out how we can adjust or kind of modify some variables or having those goals, having those self-reflective activities, that feedback can all impact their learning component. So just keeping that in mind as we go through this session today. We're going to talk a little bit about executive functioning. And then we will get into the synchronous and asynchronous components. I hope I got about 10 minutes left. I am watching the time. So I'm just going to put these on the screen for now. And so executive functioning is all about kind of framing your course and your content. So providing that clear headings that they can understand, maybe with an icon that represents what they're doing. In our online template, there are definitely, icons, headings, all screen read eligible. There's no kind of image with text in there. We made that adjustment about a couple of years ago. I went too fast. Having those logical learning objectives divided into small segments so they understand that digestible scaffolded pathway that we have talked about. Having those checklists, self-check quizzes goes to what we had referenced earlier with differentiating that degree of difficulty, and then having that immediate feedback and how you can do that, especially on quizzes in Canvas. You get a box where you can put some feedback for those who got it wrong, like, hey, this is why, here's what the answer is, here's where you can find it, so they can go learn that option. And then again, having those notes and providing hints to students if they get a problem wrong to focus on that improvement process, not necessarily the overarching outcome. So synchronous and asynchronous using UDL. So this is kind of where a lot of faculty I know are at. They're live, they're in Zoom, they're in WebEx, they're having this live session, and they're also these asynchronous students kind of watching on the back end. But here are some things that you can do in your synchronous classes to incorporate UDL principles. So thinking about what options are there in Canvas, or maybe on another tool where you can have captioning or speech to text. Maybe it's just a YouTube video that you have captioned, or Microsoft Stream, or some other platform that you run your videos through to get them captioned, or a transcript, something like that. What types of opportunities do they have to communicate with each other? So having them work in small groups or breakout rooms can be a helpful tool in synchronous discussions. Having a large class with maybe like 100 students in it is really intimidating, I think. If I'm going to speak in front of 100 students, I don't really know what they are. I can't see their cameras. It could be a little intimidating, but having a small group session, maybe with like 5 to 10 students in it, you make it a little more attention or getting that interest in the topic if I could talk in a small group. And then how can they contribute to the resources? So how can they contribute to their learning goals, contribute to the discussion? Maybe they find an article on a particular topic that they're learning in class. Even if it's just like a news article, it doesn't have to be a research article necessarily, something that lets them go search and explore on their own and then come back and share. So in terms of what techniques can you do to make sure that you have that representation, having accessible PowerPoint slides, running that Microsoft accessibility checker on every time it tells you what to change and how to change it. And if you do have any questions in your fully online class, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to help make those accessible for you. Lecturing to the whole class, and this goes into like that intimidation component of sometimes it's super intimidating to be called out in a 100-person class, and kind of having a little more broader perspective when you're giving general content and then kind of breaking it up. Having the students present to their small groups, I think is really important. And then video sharing by the instructor and the learners. And I understand sometimes bandwidth is a challenge in that area, but sometimes it can really help just understanding who they're talking to on the other end. But again, there are challenges with these. So action and expression, this is probably what I'm going to do. And I did this in one of my doctoral classes where every week we had a different note taker, and it just kept that person engaged for that session. And then we posted it to the Canvas course so that other students could add their notes. And it became this like long guide of like student created content about the subject that I still keep and refer back to because it's made by me with my students, with my colleagues, and it really is something that I value. And so having that is another way to get that buy-in of having them switch every week. And this is something that you can schedule out in the first week of classes and setting a schedule reminder like, hey, Jimmy, it's your turn to take notes. Make sure you put them in the Canvas course, maybe make a document for them to paste their notes in, and then sharing that with the class. Having those small group discussions, like I said, are also important for this like synchronous time. So what if you're asynchronous? And I apologize for the animation on there. It came up all at once, but thinking of multiple examples. So today I used a science lab example. I used a chemistry example, a circulatory system example, I apologize, and a writing example. So trying to get different areas that can hopefully touch on different interests is super important and kind of can help their level of understanding of the concept. And then again, communication, having that understanding that it can be anxiety producing, it can be intimidating to talk in a large class, and especially if you have a really large discussion board that can also be really intimidating. So breaking it up into different groups can also help, and it might help with grading. If you have 100 projects to grade versus if you split them up into different groups, you also have less projects to grade, and they get that collaborative component. So again, having those accessible PowerPoints, seeing if there's text-to-speech tools, having learners post their notes, post their questions in Canvas as well, and providing opportunities for those reflective activities. And self-assessment, and that's something it's kind of on the bottom here, but having those self-assessment activities to kind of figure out where am I in my understanding actually. Sometimes I don't know until I take the exam and I'm like, oh, I thought I knew that. But having that like self-check, maybe right before or the study guide or whatever it is to kind of really check my understanding of what I think I know can also help. So participation opportunities, and I know we are running just on, I got about 8 minutes left, so I am keeping track of the clock, and I hope to have some time for questions as well and comments. I know we have a lot of, I see some questions coming into the chat, and I really want to leave some time if anyone wants to open their mic and kind of talk about their experiences. But again, getting those notes, gathering those resources, having the small group discussion, and then asking students that getting to know you survey that I mentioned earlier in the session, seeing if they do have any barriers. Maybe it's not on their student accessibility services form, or something like that, but they still just want you to know. Maybe they're an English language learner or something like that, where you can ask up front and see if they're willing to share with you. They don't have to share, but giving them that opportunity can also help. So going into, I'm actually going to skip this scenario, but I did have a little scenario about how Professor Higgins in nursing, again, just another example, a different domain of how she can apply these synchronous and asynchronous discussion. So I'm going to skip that for now, and I apologize for that. But you will have this presentation provided, as well as the resources that are being provided in the chat. So thank you, Michelle Shaw, for also putting those in there. Some of the things that you can do in your web conferencing sessions to have that interactivity, you can do those polls that I just did, the Padlet, the Slido, kind of getting that engagement with your participants. If you have real-time captioning for presentations, or having a student do the real-time captions, maybe someone's taking notes, having that differentiated options for students to engage is also really helpful. And as we talked about, the breakout rooms. So I apologize, this animation did not work as well. So basically just talking about encouraging students to communicate in the format that they choose. So something I was thinking about as I was going over this is students may have a stutter or something like that, and asking them to speak on camera, kind of maybe in the class session, can be really challenging for someone. And if that's something that you may not know, especially in an online class, it may not be something that is revealed or something like that. So giving them the choice to type in the chat and have it be read aloud for them. That's something that we do in our virtual community of learners for our criminal justice program. We have these large live events with 60 to 80 students. And if a student is not comfortable reading a question aloud, we will read it for them, because we still want them to get their answer. But if they're not comfortable speaking for whatever reason they have, that's okay. And we have an alternative that they can choose. They can put it in the chat and we will read it out loud for them. So that's just something to keep in mind in these synchronous sessions. As you saw, there's other ways that we can get that interest, get that buy-in from students to participate in their own learning experience. So having that is also really important. Having them read an article, using the interactive whiteboard. If you use the Miro from last week, having them put something maybe in a Miro room, kind of having that prepared prior to class and also just the class discussion, doing a flipped approach. Maybe they do the work before class, and then in the live session, there's that discussion, that group dialogue can also help as well. We talked about having the students present. And then being proactive, as I talked about, having that getting to know you survey is a little more. I know we have a syllabus quiz that's in all online courses, but having something a little more personal. Maybe you use a Google form, so it's not in Canvas or something, and you ask them kind of what their preferences are, their pronouns, kind of how they want to be referred, what their feedback style is, what their dominant language is, something like that. They don't have to share it with you. You can let them know this is optional. It is not a requirement, but you're just there to listen and to be there for support if needed. And you're willing to tailor your materials to meet their best learning style. So that's really what we want for these students. We do this because we want them to learn the content and be these scholars and have this knowledge that we want to share. So if they do have their camera on, making sure they have good lighting so that you can see them speak. And then if the bandwidth allows, having your students do the same. And then, so I went a little fast in today's presentation because I know I got 2 minutes left. And so I actually will stop here. I think I only have a couple more slides. As I mentioned, if you have a student with a stutter and other delivery methods. But if you would, please take the second Slido poll. So I'm actually going to come back and activate the second poll. If you could please take that, and then I will open it up for the last couple minutes for questions. I thank everyone for their time, and I would love to hear if there are any questions or comments that someone has to share, if they want to unmute their mic. I see Michelle added, she can share videos on how to add captions to videos using YouTube or DocSoft. So DocSoft is a tool that is provided through SAS, if you Student Accessibility Services. If you go to their website, there is information on that as well. I do want to thank Michelle for being here again. I definitely appreciate you taking the time to attend this session as the Director of Student Accessibility Services. Were there any questions? I don't know if there are any other comments or questions in the chat. If not, it is 1 o'clock. I don't know if we want to wrap it up. I want to thank everyone for their time today, for joining and getting into our session. Again, I will be providing this PowerPoint presentation, as well as Michelle Shaw will also be sharing resources for faculty on this as well. Thank you everyone for your time.
And I will also step in and say thank you, Nicole, for all of this valuable information. A lot. So we appreciate it, and I know everyone's going to enjoy reviewing it when they receive the information. Thanks to everyone for taking the time today to join us. We do appreciate that.